Welcome, everyone, to our event today on how the business model of the World Bank can better respond to global challenges like climate change and pandemic risk. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the Executive Vice President and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. We at CGD are really pleased to co-host this event with Germany and Norway. This week at the Center, we've hosted policymakers from Sub-Saharan Africa to discuss country needs for vaccines, informal sector finance, and special drawing rights rechanneling. And next week, we'll talk more about SDR rechanneling at the IMF and country perspectives on and the IFI response to debt distress. But today, we'll discuss the existential threats to all human well-being and economic development, climate and pandemic, threats that were poorly understood or seemingly far off in their consequences, but that now require new and more effective approaches given mounting risks. The World Bank, built around the country loan as the key product, has really had neither the core mandate nor the adequate financing modalities needed to systematically respond to these kinds of challenges. In the session today, we'll seek to answer some key questions. How can existing commitments to meet global goals be operationalized as part of the World Bank's green, resilient, and inclusive development or GRID approach? What is the bank's comparative advantage in this space, and where can it create clear synergies with other multilateral and client country partners? And as President Malpass recently asked, how does the world help poorer countries to make larger investments in global public goods, and how should those costs be shared worldwide? It's the start of a conversation that must be broadened, but today we have two sets of speakers. A first set has led recent panels and analytical work on climate and pandemic preparedness, with a focus on recommendations for the multilateral development banks. We'll start with Lord Nicholas Stern, whose team supports COP26 preparations, and who is the author of the Stern Review, the seminal 2006 study on the economics of climate change. And we'll follow with the two co-chairs of the high-level independent panel for financing the global commons of pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Honorable Professor Lawrence Summers, who will discuss their report and its implications for the World Bank. But they'll also draw on their chairmanship of two earlier panels on ways that the MDB could better build global public goods into their work. The second set of speakers will reflect on these issues from the perspective of some of the major shareholders at the World Bank. We'll start with Andy Balkel, the Acting Assistant Director for International Affairs at the United States Department of Treasury, and we'll follow with a great panel of Lena Lind, the Executive Director for the Nordic Baltic countries, Naoko Ishii from the University of Tokyo, Ed Mountfield, the Vice President for OPCS at the World Bank, alongside Nancy Lee, a CGD expert thinking through MDB financing instruments for global public goods. And this session will be facilitated by CGD President Masoud Ahmed. And we'll end with some reflections from Jürgen Zottler, Director General for International Development Policy at Germany's BMZ, as well as Masoud. So let's get started with a welcome from Norbert Bartle. He's the Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and participants, one thing which we have seen very clearly in recent months is that global challenges are having a defining impact on the lives of everyone in the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has consequences for our lives in just the same way as the impacts of climate change that are becoming more and more evident. Neither their causes nor their consequences can be held in check by national borders, which once more goes to show that we can only master the current challenges that we are facing through our joint efforts. At the same time, there is also an opportunity here. Although the COVID-19 crisis has thrown us off track, delaying the achievement of sustainability and development goals by years. Massive sums are now being invested in the recovery. We therefore have a duty to use these funds in the right way for implementing the 2030 Agenda and for achieving the Paris climate goals. In this situation, the World Bank is called upon more than ever to do justice to its name and to be a bank for the whole world. For us as shareholders, it is clear that the World Bank is more than the sum of its parts. At the spring meeting, it sent a signal with its grid approach, indicating that, together with its shareholders, it wants to rise to the challenges. Now it is important that the bank put grit into practice with concrete measures, because it is not the paper, it is the results that count. The crisis is also an opportunity for the bank, as well an opportunity to regroup. This means that the bank should do ever more to adapt itself to the global nature of its tasks. It can show that it is not just a bank for the nations of this world. Instead, it can be the bank for the world in its entirety by working on global tasks and financing the protection and provision of global public goods. An answer to the current challenges cannot just revolve around simply investing more. The bank should not just promote investments that pay off in individual countries. Instead, it must create the incentives for investments that are also specifically aimed at addressing regional and global dimensions. Together with the World Bank and with other multilateral and national institutions, we must support the world's countries in making investments in global public goods and reforming their economies accordingly. And we must find ways to distribute any possible additional costs arising from these investments in a fair manner, so that the necessary transition is a just transition. It is therefore not enough for the bank to provide the funds. Its convening power and its know-how in the same way as it has done in the past. That is why I am calling on the World Bank to develop concrete proposals for how it can integrate grid and the protection of global public goods consistently into its business model and measure them. The G20 high-level independent panel has put forward proposals in this regard. We need suitable operational methods and financial frameworks in order to prioritize global tasks and include the true price of goods and investments which have impacts that go beyond national borders in the calculations being made. Only then will there also be more resources available for global engagement and for making greater use of policy funding. I'm sure that today's side event will generate new ideas for ways that the World Bank can successfully contribute to overcoming global challenges. Together with all of you, I'm looking forward to an exciting and stimulating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. State Secretary. Now let's turn to Lord Nicholas Stern on the opportunities for the World Bank to build on its increasing strength in climate finance.
Our subject is a bank for the world, how the business model of the bank can better respond to global challenges. So I want to focus on the global challenges of climate, environment, biodiversity, and pandemics. And I'll see the global challenges as defined in large measure, shared in large measure, agreed in large measure through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on Climate of 2015, COP21. So we are talking through the SDGs, through the Paris Agreement, and of course when we think about pandemics as well, we're talking about global public goods. But these global public goods are shaped and delivered by investment and action locally. So what I want to focus on here particularly is the story of climate and development. That's the language that the World Bank President, David Malpass, has been using, and rightly so. We're looking for a new way of approaching development, which is much cleaner and safer, and I would argue also more efficient and more dynamic. And that is the story. It's a growth story. It's a development story. We can create sustainable, inclusive, resilient growth and make the recovery from COVID a route to exactly that. That's the theme of the high-level advisory group, which the IMF and the World Bank has formed, and which I co-chair with Chela Pazabazioglu of the IMF and Mari Pangestu of the World Bank. So the bank is going to have to act quickly and scale up now, but stay strong, keep those investment levels high for the next many years. That means, of course, that the capital adequacy will come into question. And there are lots of things the bank can do to make better use of its balance sheets, increase its private sector multipliers, and so on. But at some point, in some cases quite soon, and with the World Bank quite soon, I think, that capital adequacy issue will be there. So what we would look to the shareholders to do is to push very hard for the kinds of extra investments that are crucial in this story. Investment and innovatory investment. But at the same time, the shareholders should be saying that if you step up, if you move in the right direction, if you step up and stay up, then we will be ready to support you as these capital issues arise. So let me pass over now to the panel, but I hope in the context I've tried to offer, I can put 3 or 4 questions. First, given the importance of these extra investments and the new kinds of investments, how can the bank help pull them through? And secondly, how can it help provide the finance that's necessary to support those investments and manage the systemic and fundamental change we're talking about? And that will include managing dislocation. It will include in investment programs and first loss offsets, guarantees, long-term loans, mezzanine loans, managing risks and managing transformation through the finance sector. So that was the second. The third question, can you help with good examples of the way in which such change and the involvement of the World Bank in such change has actually happened in countries that you know particularly well, sectors that you know particularly well. And the final question for the panel is around collaboration. These are global public goods, even though shaped by actions at the local level. How do we foster collaboration? How do we get people to share experience, to help understand policy, to invest in R&D of the right kind, to go to scale together? Because if the world goes to scale together, it will drive costs down faster. That will involve some competition and it will involve some collaboration, but collaboration will be important. We do have the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action. We do have the network on greening the finance system. There are some areas where collaboration really is moving, but it will be difficult because there will be some who will try to free ride or go more slowly. How do we incentivize those whilst at the same time pushing forward with those who are going faster and trying to raise ambition and trying to support each other in going faster? For those who are going slower, carbon border adjustment mechanisms might arise. But we really have to concentrate on the question, the more positive version of the question. How do we foster collaboration? So over to you, panel. I'm sure we're going to hear some really great ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lord Stern. I think some key points coming up that apply obviously to the climate risk, but also to the pandemic risk, which our next speakers, Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam and the Honorable Professor Lawrence Summers, will tell us a little bit about the panel that they led and the insights there. Go ahead, Tharman. You're on mute.
I'll start first and hand over to Larry. I think State Secretary Norbert Butler summarized the challenge extremely well and very succinctly. The World Bank has to adapt itself in quite fundamental ways to a world where the largest challenges facing not just the global system, but facing individual countries are coming out of the global commons and the deterioration of the global commons. As Nick has just mentioned, it's climate crisis, it's pandemic security, and it's the loss of biodiversity, each intersecting with the other. And we really need to take a step back and reposition and repurpose the World Bank together with the other MDBs, and in some important respects together with the IMF as well, to address this fundamental fact that the largest challenge facing individual countries today and in the future rest in the deterioration of the global commons. Now, why it is such a complex issue is also because the scale of the existing traditional challenges has also got much larger. Well before this COVID pandemic, we already recognized that the scale of investment required in infrastructure, in education, in everything that gets economic development going was going to be much larger in the next decade compared to anything we've previously seen, in large part because of the demographic bulge in Africa and some other parts of the developing world, South Asia especially. And by any assessment, the usual sources of finance and the usual ways of organizing finance were going to be greatly inadequate. And this is before even talking about the global commons. Second, the scale of the setback that we've seen in this crisis hasn't quite been fully appreciated, because we're not just talking about a standstill in education and national well-being. We've actually had a very deep reversal. It's not just a lost year of schooling or lost 2 years of schooling, but actually the kids have forgotten what they learned in the first place. We've actually gone backwards in ways that are going to play out for many years to come. So it's a huge task now, addressing what was already an extant challenge, much larger than before, addressing the large and deep setback that we've already had, and now tackling this looming set of global commons challenges. And to do it, we need a fundamental repurposing of the World Bank together with the other IFIs. We know that the system is greatly underfunded, and global public goods in particular, as the State Secretary has highlighted, require much more resilient funding, larger and more resilient funding. The only way we are going to do it is to strengthen multilateralism, and to do it in ways that are in keeping with the geopolitics of today's world, with the willingness of countries to come up with more resources, even in their own nations. We've got to be realistic, but we have to do a lot more within that realm of realism, and it can be done. The high-level panel that Larry and I co-chair together with Ngozi Iweala, and which Masood and Amanda and Naoko were all involved in, has set out a set of proposals, doable proposals to strengthen multilateralism in the context of pandemic security, and we show how it's actually affordable. It must require strengthening the WHO. The WHO has been weakened over the years. It requires more resources, and it requires empowering in its key functions. It does require repurposing the World Bank and the IFIs for a world which now has fundamentally different challenges facing the countries that the World Bank seeks to help, as the State Secretary and as I just elaborated on. It does require not just the usual instruments of financing, but more grant financing, because intrinsic in countries having to invest in global public goods is that they're not going to get all the benefits for themselves. They don't have full incentive to be able to put in those investments, and they require greater grant support. And it does require that we develop creatively new multilateral mechanisms to strengthen a system that today rests on silos, a fragmented system in global health security. We're not going to be able to either raise resources or deploy it well or have impact on the basis of today's fragmented system of global health security. It requires a multilateral mechanism to raise funds and to deploy them to plug gaps swiftly and with some force in a way that individual institutions can't. Neither the individual multilateral institutions or the individual global health organizations. And we believe it can be done affordably by creating a new fund for the purpose, which all countries contribute to. It's extremely affordable, even if you want to be less conservative than our panel has been. You're really talking about numbers that are tiny compared to the amount that has been spent in this pandemic and the amount that the next pandemic is going to cost. So we're really talking about putting aside small investments relative to the huge costs that we would otherwise face. But I want to finally just take a step back and say that given that triple challenge that we face, that even on traditional grounds, we are going to have to raise a lot more resources to be able to avoid a disaster in development. Second, we've got to redress what has been a very deep setback in this crisis. And third, we now have to redress the global commons. It means that more broadly, development finance has to be reorganized. We've got to get a lot more bang for the shareholder buck. And it means using the unique ability of the World Bank and the MDBs to mobilize private finance, as Nick was just mentioning, and as the State Secretary was implying, it does require the World Bank to pivot towards mitigating risk as distinct from using its balance sheet to extend loans. And there's a whole set of instruments, some of which are being used, but honestly, we've got to be a lot bolder, and we've got to move with some urgency towards this new model of mobilizing private finance for a whole set of domestic infrastructure and other public goods for which there is an economic return, but we have to de-risk the environment. Second, the capital adequacy models of the World Bank and the other MDBs needs fundamental relook, and that's one of the proposals of the previous Eminent Persons Group report that the Italian presidency, G20 presidency, is now taking up to fundamentally review the capital adequacy frameworks for the MDBs, which are far too conservative, really. Thirdly, we've got to find ways in which the system works as a system, which is not happening today. The individual MDBs, the bilateral agencies, and the private sector are not working together. And the World Bank has now started working on country platforms, which had been previously recommended, but we really need to take that very seriously. We are wasting a lot of resources, and we're not achieving the impact we want by working individually. And I would just end off by saying that if I were to redraw the mandate of the World Bank, it would be global public goods, and it would be focusing on human capital and policy reform. And if we can do those things well within the resources available, I think we stand a 50-50 chance of succeeding in the next decade. Over to you, Larry.
Thank you very much, Tarman. Tarman has been a remarkable leader on these issues for a long time. I'm humbled by the opportunity to be with so much expertise on these vital topics. Let me step back and put this in a broad perspective. Throughout human history, the primary source of cross-border caused human suffering has been war. It has been military conflict. It has been violence, culminating in the tragedies of the first half of the 20th century. It was the remarkable triumph of the Bretton Woods system after the Second World War and it established a framework in which the amount of cross-border suffering caused by war has fallen in the last 75 years to less than a tenth of what it was in the first half of the 20th century. And in the 21st century so far, to less than a third of what it was in the latter part of the 20th century. Those are extraordinary achievements of international cooperation. We in the United States can, I believe, take considerable pride for all the mistakes we made in our leadership. Today, the principal threat to human security coming across borders is no longer military conflict. Of course, we must retain vigilance with respect to balancing power and maintaining military security. But the greatest threat to my children's generation, to my as yet unborn grandchildren's generation, is no longer a hostile power. It is the deterioration of the global environment, and it is the spread of pandemic, virus, or germ. Those are our primary threats. And yet, the global system's response are entirely disproportionate. Every 2 days, as many Americans are dying as of COVID as died in the 9/11 attacks. We have not yet committed in the United States 1% of what was committed in response to 9/11 to the global threat of pandemic disease. Our efforts with respect to global climate change, which literally for the first time threatens the existential conditions for life on Earth, are a very small fraction of annual commitments to military security. There is a complete disproportion between the efforts around different kinds of threats. I am not making a moral or altruistic argument, though there is a compelling moral and altruistic argument to be made with respect to those in poverty, with respect to poor nations. I am noting the stark juxtaposition of epically low borrowing rates in every major industrialized country and epically high return rates on investments in climate change, on investments in pandemic preparedness and response. There has not been a larger gap between opportunity and execution. There has not been a larger gap between what the major problem is and what the direction of energy is in decades. Just as the prevailing problem containing economic frustration and, as a consequence, rising hostile powers was met at Bretton Woods, there is a need for a renovation and reinvention of the global system today. It is the capacity of the international financial institutions that represents the world's principal tool in responding. They need to be rethought, replenished, and reinvented. And as the leader of those institutions directed at the broad solution to global problem. That rethinking, replenishment, and reinvention needs to begin at the World Bank. To be sure, the World Bank cannot do it alone. To be sure, an effort of this kind must truly be global and multilateral and based on the judgments of all countries. To be sure, finance ministers like myself, former finance ministers like myself, have a tendency to think too quickly and too exclusively of the international financial institutions rather than the institutions of the UN system, the UN itself, crucially the World Health Organization, which must remain at the center of any effort to combat global pandemic. What's involved in rethinking, reinventing, replenishing, and revitalizing or renewing the World Bank? I would suggest several steps. First, a redefinition of its name and mission to explicitly embrace the centrality of sustainability by naming it the International Bank for Reconstruction and Sustainability and Development. To underscore that there is nothing equally important. It is absolutely the case, as Tarman emphasized, absolutely the case that the world must remain focused on poverty issues where it has lost substantial ground in recent times. But that is not enough. A World Bank must really be a World Bank, not a bank only directed at the poorest country and the poorest peoples. And that means centrally an emphasis on sustainability, where there is a desperate need for finance. And as those zero interest rates, less than 1% interest rates, even that a country like Greece can borrow at, suggest ample availability of capital. Second, there needs to be a comprehensive rethinking of the capital model for this era of low interest rates, where the reality is that the traditional distinctions we have drawn between concessional finance and non-concessional finance have much less meaning when the SDR interest rate is closer to zero than it is to any other integer. What we used to think of as traditional non-concessional finance is cheaper than concessional finance used to be. And that means we need a systematic rethinking. Companies in the United States, households in the United States, countries in Europe are able to borrow at rates today that would have been inconceivable a generation or even a decade, even 2 decades ago. A similar rethinking of international public financial intermediation is in order. One crucial component of that rethinking needs to be far more innovation and far less siloing than we have seen as we approach the support for private sector finance. MEGA, the IFC, and the World Bank's guarantee programs need no longer to be siloed, but must complement each other if private finance is to be catalyzed on the appropriate scale. Third, the Trump era US-driven commitment that the last capital increase of the World Bank was going to be the last capital increase for the World Bank, and that it was now going to operate permanently on the basis of that capital. That judgment must be recognized as either a mistake at the time or a reasonable judgment at the time that has been superseded by subsequent events. In either event, it can no longer be a reasonable policy in a world of a growing economy and global problems growing faster than the global economy. The idea of a static World Bank is a profound misconception. The world must come together, reject that approach, and move towards an innovative approaches to broadly increasing the World Bank's capital on the basis of the kind of renewal that I have described. Fourth, these resources for the World Bank must be complemented by reinvention of the ways in which it does business. It needs to operate on 21st century rhythms of speed, use 21st century information technology in new ways. It must be leaner and meaner in the way in which it carries out its business. Much should be asked of the World Bank and its leadership, but much should be expected. This is a task for the officials of the World Bank, but it is ultimately a task for the international community, ultimately a task for its major shareholders. There is no reason why the world's problems, why these challenges cannot be met. You know, there's a famous moment, and on this note, I will conclude, in the history of diplomacy that has come to light only fairly recently. President Reagan had his first meeting with President Gorbachev. And after they read their talking points at each other, they went for a walk, accompanied only by their translators, as the officials in both sides sat in modest terror back at headquarters, wondering what was going to happen when the two leaders were on their own. And as the story is told, at some point, President Reagan said to General Secretary Gorbachev, suppose we were attacked by Martians. Would you come to our aid? And Gorbachev looked nonplussed, paused, laughed, and said, of course I would. And of course we would. If we were attacked, President Reagan, would you come to our aid? And the answer again was yes. They got along better after that? Well, to my knowledge, we on Earth are not being attacked by Martians, but we are being attacked by viruses. We will be much more severely attacked by viruses in the future on every reasonable prediction. And we are being threatened by the legacy of what we have all put in the atmosphere. And that same threat, needs to bind us together in common purpose going forward. It's a central issue for the foreign policy of all nations, and it can begin with cooperation on the reinvention of the World Bank and the development bank system. Thank you very much.
Many, many thanks, Larry and Tharman, for that call to arms, rethink, replenish, and reinvent. We're going to move on now to our next speaker, who is the Acting Undersecretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Treasury. He'll start with some remarks, and we'll have a quick conversation. Go ahead, Andy.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I also want to thank the Center for Global Development, Norway, and Germany for co-hosting this event, and very much appreciate the comments of the previous speakers, Lord Stern, Tharman, and of course our former secretary here at Treasury, Larry Summers. We here at Treasury appreciate the work that CGD has undertaken to think about whether the tools we currently have in the multilateral development space are fit for purpose to respond to the development challenges we face today. The ongoing impacts from COVID and climate change reinforce the need to look at how our toolkits and those of the development banks need to adapt as we address these risks. The United States is committed to helping shape these discussions and the policy reforms needed to respond to these challenges. As the leading development finance institution, the World Bank is at the center of these conversations. We need to fully leverage the bank's expertise, global presence, and experience to address critical challenges on global health security and climate change. Our collective top priority at the moment is to end the current pandemic. Alongside other countries, the United States has pledged to donate over 1 billion vaccines. We have already shared over 175 million. President Biden has reaffirmed at the summit to end COVID last month that we are firmly committed to the goal of vaccinating 40% of the world's population by the end of this year and 70% by the middle of next year. The World Bank's financing of vaccines is an important part of this response. As in its recent activities with COVAX and AVAT, we urge the bank to continue to utilize its flexibility and emergency approaches to support diagnostics, medical countermeasures, and therapeutics at the country and regional level. As vaccine supplies increase, we also look to the bank and other international organizations to identify and respond to vaccine readiness gaps. When countries receive vaccines, they should be ready to use them quickly, effectively, and efficiently. The Multilateral Leaders Task Force can help focus attention on where such assistance is most needed. As we resolve the immediate crisis, we must also seize the moment to improve our ability to prevent, detect, and respond to future pandemics. The World Bank will be critical to these efforts as well. This includes, as discussed by Minister Tharman and Larry Summers, multilateral mechanisms to deal with these issues. In our view, this could include creation of a financial intermediary fund to help finance the estimated $15 billion per year needed for global pandemic preparedness. To achieve this ambition of stronger preparedness, funding for such a fund must be additional to, and not divert from, existing and future support for the WHO and other global health programs. The World Bank, like all development banks, operates on a country demand-driven model, while many critical pandemic preparedness needs are also at the regional and global level. The country-led model has important benefits, but it can also lead to gaps where we need complementary instruments. We therefore support creation of a financial intermediary fund, as announced by Vice President Harris at the COVID summit last month, to help fill these gaps. There are 3 ways in which the World Bank can be core to a financial fund. First, the World Bank can host the fund. providing valuable operational expertise. Second, the bank should be a key implementing partner alongside other finance and health authorities. And third, the grants from the fund can leverage additional pandemic and preparedness response financing at the bank. In addition to a financial intermediary fund, we support the creation of a global health and finance board to help coordinate health and finance ministries along with the WHO, other public health authorities, and international financial institutions, including the bank. COVID has revealed a formal coordination gap among these authorities. Drawing on the expertise of the Financial Stability Board, we see a strong rationale for formalized coordination so that we can better prevent, detect, and respond to future health crises. I should say drawing on the experience from Financial Stability Board, not the expertise, experience as a template. Near-term efforts to end the pandemic and advance reforms to address future pandemics are mutually reinforcing. So as we say, we need to be able to walk and chew gum on these issues at the same time. Of course, pandemics are not the only serious threat that we face. As has been mentioned, climate change is an existential threat. Limiting the world's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will require a rapid transition to a more sustainable global economy. Multilateral development banks play a leading role here. They can help economies prioritize climate investments, integrate climate resilience into infrastructure planning, protect critical ecosystems, and increase climate ambition as part of their nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies. In that context, we welcome the World Bank's recently revised Climate Change Action Plan and increased climate finance targets. We look forward to seeing concrete plans in the country climate and development reports planned for next year. World Bank should also demonstrate leadership by minimizing support for fossil fuel investments and increasing energy access. Aligning the bank's financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement will be a critical issue going forward. In recent years, large institutional investors and other private asset managers have made trillions of dollars of commitments to invest in climate-related sectors. However, the mobilization of private capital for climate has lagged the needs of developing countries due to a variety of reasons, including governance, investment climate, policy issues, and project-level risks. The World Bank and peer institutions have a critical role to play in translating the momentum created by private sector commitments into concrete projects in developing countries, as Tharman alluded to, related to de-risking. Secretary Yellen has convened a meeting of the heads of the multilateral development banks over the summer, where she asked each institution to develop concrete plans to raise their climate ambitions and identify specific ways that they could mobilize climate finance. She'll reconvene a similar group next week as we look to make more progress in advance of COP26. As Lord Stern mentioned, we also need collaboration in this area. Secretary Yellen is also participating in the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. Let me say a brief word about World Bank financing issues, particularly IDA. Later this month, the United States and the other IDA participants will meet again to discuss the 20th IDA replenishment. As we saw during the pandemic, IDA surged its existing financing and front-loaded resources to provide crisis financing to the world's poorest countries. In response, the United States and other IDA donors have advanced the IDA replenishment by 1 year in order to sustain enhanced levels of grants and concessional loans and provide the most vulnerable countries a high-quality alternative to non-transparent and unsustainable borrowing. As we seek to finalize important priorities for this replenishment, we must remain mindful of the health crisis that got us to this inflection point. For this reason, IDA needs to make inroads in pandemic preparedness and strengthening health systems. Importantly, we believe IDA should encourage countries to invest in their own preparedness. Beyond that, we are also focused on how IDA will support countries' investments in a greener, more inclusive, and resilient recovery. We especially welcome IDA's emphasis on climate, fragility, jobs, human capital, and gender equality. Sustained recovery also requires greater actions to address debt risks by building on IDA's sustainable development finance policy, strengthening creditor outreach, and fully supporting the G20 Common Framework. Bilateral creditors need to fully participate in the implementation of the Common Framework. Finally, we want to see IDA strive higher to ensure that the recovery is inclusive for all, including women, girls, and sexual and gender minorities. In closing, let me thank Masood, Amanda, and the Center for Global Development for your engagement on these issues. We look forward to continued collaboration with the bank and our partners as we address these challenges. I look forward to the comments from the next panel on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andy. We had hoped to have a little bit more conversation, but I think the best thing is to move to the next panel and to turn over the session to our CGD president, Masood Ahmed, who will guide us through the next section of our discussion. Over to you, Masood.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And thanks also to all of our speakers, State Secretary Norbert Bartley, and then Nick Stern, Tharman, and Larry, and then finally, Andy, thank you very much for setting that out. So now we move to the panel and second set of speakers. And I guess what I would like to ask each of the panelists for a quick reaction first to what they've heard. And in a way, we can take for given by now that the global agenda has broadened out from being focused primarily on how to help individual developing countries make progress to looking at and finding an adequate response to global challenges that will impact the lives of everyone. And the case has been made compellingly that that requires a shift in the focus, the vision, the business model of the development banks, and in particular, the World Bank as a leader of that. And Larry laid out some very specific ideas on how that could be done. Andy's talked about some of the things that are already in train and that could be strengthened. And I wanted to come to each of you and ask you first, what is your reaction to what you have heard? Do you think this is there is, first of all, a comparative advantage in the World Bank as it is currently organized, envisioned to play that kind of role? Is it an incremental improvement in what it does? Or is it more than doing a little bit more on global public goods, but really stepping back and rethinking its approach to global public goods? So we have four panelists. We're going to start with Naoko Ishii. Naoko, you currently run the Center for Global Commons, but you have enormous experience of working in the multilateral system. And I want to first get your quick reaction to this, to what you've heard. Does this kind of make you feel empowered? Let's go for it. Or are you thinking this is going to be a very difficult thing to do? What's your take on it?
Well, actually, I was quite encouraged to hear that those previous speakers basically actually plead the bank that you can take it or you can do it kind of thing. Actually, before we talk about shifting the World Bank purpose or the mission or the way of doing business, we have to shift the economics, the business model in general, because the reason we have this global challenges because our current economic system really doesn't price adequately the nature or the natural capital or those global public goods. That's why we have this challenge of climate change, biodiversity, also COVID-19, or even societal division. So before we think about World Bank, we have to think about how the business model should be shifted. Then the question is, in this regard, what the World Bank can do, kind of thing. So from that point of view, I still believe that the business, shifting the business model itself is a huge challenge. We were basically challenging this entire existing model, but I still do believe the World Bank has a very good opportunity and then the role to take it for several reasons. The one is a mission. As everybody said, the World Bank mission, development and poverty reduction, but it all now understand it hinges on how to manage the global commons, so that the mission is very much fit. But the second and maybe most importantly, I very much cherish and the value the World Bank board. After I left the World Bank 10 years ago, I actually went to the GEF. Then the board is totally different. It's much more diverse, and the language is different, the concept is different, the value system is different, and go back to the World Bank board, they are all finance ministers who do understand the economic logic, the business logic. So they do understand investing in public goods has a very good payoff later, so that it's an economic logic, it's a finance logic, it's a business logic, so that while that we do have still a lot of difficulties to convince finance ministers, but if we are not able to convince finance ministers or World Bank board, there is no other place to really shift that model in place. So I still do have a lot of hope that how we can convince the World Bank board, board of directors and finance ministers, and to sell this logic, to invest in the global public goods. It's a great the growth story, the great investment story, and it's a great payoff to the individual country, where we still need to think about how to operationalize it, the combining that the grants and loans and the private sector and the other partners to basically reorganize financing system. But then once you are able to convince your board, I think we do have a great, the future for all. Thank you, Masood.
Thank you very much, Taoko. So you're putting the onus a little bit here on saying, we have to convince the board of the World Bank first for the World Bank to be able to make progress. That's a very nice segue to Lene Lynch. Lene, you are on the board of the World Bank. You represent the Nordic Baltic countries. Nordic Baltic countries have always been big supporters of the multilateral system. So do you feel that the shareholders, as represented in the board, need convincing on this issue, that really the priority now is moving towards dealing with global public goods much more centrally, climate, pandemics, biodiversity? Do you think they worry a lot that this could be a diversion away from the focus on poverty? Can we chew gum and walk at the same time? I mean, what is the issue here from your perspective? How do you react?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the previous speakers and for the ability to join exactly in my capacity as a member of the board of executive directors of the World Bank, but also and in thus representing the shareholders that were mentioned, but also representing the bank, I would say, the second hat that I'm carrying. And the third hat, I would say, as a development practitioner coming into this, and thus with a slightly different angle. Yes, I would say yes and no to that question. I do think we feel still that the bank is one of the major conveners to have a discussion on global public goods, and also to drive the analytical agenda and the discussion on it. And I think the bank has done so in the past. So it's a very, very important multilateral venue for this. It continues to be. And I also think our positioning very in close proximity to the IMF is quite important in this regard. So we see, a lot of compatibility with what we do and what the board over there does, with a similar responsibility and access to finance ministers. I do think this is key. It's unique to the World Bank system. And yes, those who hold the money in their hands needs to be convinced, and it's kind of our duty to do so. So this is quite unique. And I would like to say that, when we talk about reinventing and redirecting, and again, speaking from a practitioner's point of view, all of this discussion needs to land in somebody's inbox, and somebody needs to take that action order in it. And I think we are quite well placed to do so. I still think so. We would like the bank to invest more, as was said by previous colleagues, in the global goods discussion and agenda. And I think there are very clever ways of doing so. And I think the bank is well placed to provide solutions for that. And I would push back a little bit to other speakers and saying, well, you in this conversation that you have in many quarters and in many areas, you need to include the bank early in this discussion. We are not seeing that the bank is included early enough in this conversation. And the bank needs to have presence to be able to provide those solutions. So I'm going to push back very clearly and say, at that level too, you need to merge and include this aspect to your conversation, because to provide solutions, you need to be part of the conversation. But I would say, yes, the big advantage we have and we continue to believe so, is the client-driven and country-based business model. And we also believe that this strong footprint and presence and instrument and tools that the bank has to provide to countries, combined with finance, is a major tool in assisting them in reaching development goals. And we are a development institution. I don't want to lose that lens in this discussion. There's a lot of complexity around IBRD countries, IDA countries, different incentives, different investments. But for us as a constituency, targeting the poverty aspects of this throughout our discussion is extremely important. And the challenges of some countries to leapfrog to the level of discussion that we are having is immense. So yes, we believe we need to do that through the country model, but believe we are well placed for the bank to advise those countries to work towards those global common goods via that country-based model. I would say that we would like the bank to develop more and better methodology to measure, are we actually traveling in that direction, and are we actually delivering on the global public goods through this model? I think the methodology there could be improved, particularly in climate, in nature, in biodiversity, critical aspects. I think we are starting to think about that. And the grid and other approaches the bank has have been mentioned. But I'd like to say, since we speak about climate as one of the critical areas, you know, the country level policy dialogue and advisory services that the bank has, and through the new climate change action plan actually helps countries develop their nationally determined contributions to deliver on this agenda. And that is a very direct line of approach with quite measurable deliverables. And so this is, I think, is one of many very good examples where the country-based model works. Now, having said all of that, we agree that a forward-leaning approach on emerging agendas is necessary. It's not always perhaps the bank that should have the lead. There are other important institutions, but we should all help. And the bank also has a specific challenge across its own institutions, as was mentioned, with the IFC, with MIGA, to align, and I would say to an extreme degree align, and we feel more than we do today to travel in the same direction. So it requires a lot from us. And I think within the current global governance structure, which is what is limiting all of us, a lot of what is being suggested by the panel requires a different global and regional governance structure. And pending that, which might have to take place, a discussion in another forum, I have to say, I think we're doing quite well. And because there is so much to do, we really have to continue doing. And as a board representative, we need to take this responsibility to take the dialogue in both directions at the bank and back home to say, guys, you need to align across your own government. You can't speak with two tongues in different institutions. There needs to be coordination there. And there needs to be collaboration between organizations. So I think we're up for the challenge. The conversation needs to continue. But I am not seeing this need for this huge change of approach as long as the world looks the way it does. But we are very hungry and eager for results, and we really join you in that urgency. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Letty. So what I take away is that, you know, using the country-based model, adapting it, but working within the sort of current broad framework without a huge change, we can do better. The World Bank can do better, and there are ways in which you can have impact on outcomes, and as you say, and we just need to make that case, and in some areas maybe go faster. I'll come back to you in a while on whether the country-based model is itself a barrier in some ways, and should the bank go beyond it? I'll come back on that if I may. But I want to come to Nancy next. I'm saving Ed, I'm saving you for last, because in a way I think it's important for you to hear everyone before I come to you. But Nancy, so you've thought a lot about MDBs and the way in which they could get involved, particularly in mobilizing private finance. That Harman talked about the need to think differently about how we mobilize private finance. what's your take on what you've heard? Do you think it's essentially kind of, making incremental changes at the margin will get us there, or are we looking at some really basic re-envisioning, reimagining, as Larry was saying, and then reinventing?
Well, thanks, Masood. And I have to strongly agree with the notion of a very basic rethinking of the size of the system, as well as the design of the system. Both have to come at this moment. We just went through a major test of the capacity of the international financial institutions to respond to a global and prolonged shock that was not caused by financial or economic factors. And I think the evidence suggests that they're better at finance surges when the shock is financial than they are when the shock is the GPG related shock that we saw. The MDBs collectively increased their finance, but the increase was distinctly smaller than in the global financial crisis. IDA, by the way, was a major exception, which I think is important in the context of the current replenishment discussions. The private finance arms of the MDBs, as you were mentioning, lagged, and in fact, they weren't able really to mount a major counter-cyclical surge, and in fact, private finance from the MDBs to poor countries actually fell. And we saw a significant increase in the health operations of these institutions, but from a very low base. So, and then on the climate side, we're seeing a lot of focus on finance inputs and a lot of focus on the share of operations that are climate related, but not a lot of focus on climate outcomes and outputs. The G20 has asked these institutions to identify a path to net zero, and we have not yet seen a collective response. And generally, as Tharman was saying before, we didn't see any more evidence that the system is acting as a system, that the institutions are collaborating across each other than we do in normal ways. And I think that outcome is really squarely in the responsibility of the shareholders themselves. So I would say, what does all that mean? What's all the implication of that? First of all, the system does need to be bigger. We actually did a calculation of how much MDB lending it would take to add 3 percentage points of GDP to spending from poor countries and 0.5% to spending from higher income developing countries. And so that would amount to about $230 billion, which is 60% larger than the collective lending of the largest MDBs in 2020. So as Tharman was saying before, we had a big gap before all of this happened, and it's only increased. So we need both capital increases in institutions, as well as more aggressive stretching of existing capital. There's some institutions that are really capital constrained, like the African Development Bank. Others really deploy, all of them really deploy very conservative lending strategies. And the last thing I'll say is that I think we're missing a piece of global architecture, which is oversight of the MDBs as a system. I don't think we can continue to rely simply on oversight in individual boards, nor can we rely on the G20 and the G7, which sort of intermittently offers guidance to the MDBs, but not really in terms of an ongoing strategy. So I think we need a piece of architecture that brings the MDBs together, along with other key actors in health and climate, like the IMF, like the WHO, like COVAX, to create strategies for achieving the MDBs, achieving the GPG goals that are global as well as for individual countries, and then to oversee those strategies. It will be very hard to create more architecture, but I think the costs of not doing so are justify the effort.
Thank you very much, Nancy. So I'll come back to you on some of this, but on your last point about the need for some architecture that looks across organizations, tries to take a sort of coherent approach, that is, at least in the pandemic prevention and preparedness and response space, the proposal that the G20 sponsored high-level panel has come up with of having a global health threats board. That is exactly the idea, is to bring together those different organizations. Now, that focuses on one area, obviously, and I think what you're thinking of is something that looks more broadly, and we're thinking through what's the best way to organize that broader agenda. So, Ed, you've had a lot of suggestions, proposals thrown at you, and I want to come to you now. You're the Vice President for OpenCS, which is the sort of central hub of the World Bank for looking at its operations and policies. And you listen to all of these ideas. What's your take in terms of how feasible will it be for the World Bank to sort of actually move in that direction? What are the constraints that you face as leadership of the World Bank? What do you need to move forward in realizing that vision that so many speakers today and in other fora have laid out?
Well, thanks, Masood, and thanks for the invitation to participate today. These are big questions and some very substantial arguments and suggestions have been put on the table. So let me try to briefly comment, and I really welcome all the suggestions made, and I also welcome the opportunity to continue the engagement beyond this meeting today. So on the big question of how can the World Bank support national development goals, global public goods, and crisis response at the same time, let me say that I see these as in many ways complementary goals. And I think, as is perhaps most evident to people in developing countries, the world is clearly facing a series of emergencies, including COVID, climate change, and conflict. And it goes without saying that these are global challenges, and we need massively stepped up global action and fairer burden sharing. But I want to, a little bit like Leonard, challenge the dichotomy that is sometimes drawn between the World Bank's country-driven development model and the global public goods agenda. In fact, I want to argue that making country-driven development and global action work hand in hand is what the World Bank is all about. Of course, it's Economics 101 and it's Development 101 that a poor country left on its own will underinvest in global public goods, partly because of the inherent externalities and partly because it can't afford to invest enough. But addressing that problem and not leaving poor countries on their own is exactly what the World Bank was set up for. It's at the very heart of our country engagement model and our institutional DNA that we strive to reconcile the national priorities of the country with the global priorities of that our shareholders give us money to advance, whether that's reducing poverty or reducing carbon. And as Jim Wolfenson never failed to remind many of us, the only way to make progress on global goals is to tailor them to country circumstances and build national ownership. Climate change, to take just one of these challenges, is a global challenge, and we need global goals. But the investments and policies required to achieve climate goals are radically different between South Africa and the Sahel, or between India and the Maldives. The world is complicated. And unless the governments and businesses and citizens of countries own climate action, it's not going to happen, even if the hundreds of billions a year promised for climate and other global public goods are to materialize. So you asked about the comparative advantage of the World Bank in global collective action and financing. So I've given you one, which is its ability to integrate country-driven development and global action and make them highly complementary. And as Professor Summers noted, that the bank has a proud track record of helping advance the global public good of poverty reduction, despite the setbacks of the past year, and thanks in no small part to the work of people like Masood and Nick and Larry and Naoko during their time at the bank. And we're constantly evolving as we work with our clients and our shareholders to forge new areas of global partnership. Global public goods were at the core of the IBRD capital package and the IDA 19 policy commitments. Under IDA 19, in addition to the performance-based country allocations, we have specific envelopes and windows to incentivize focus on global and regional priorities, which amount, if you put them all together, to almost a quarter of the total commitment authority. But more even than these IDA policy commitments and windows, it's the knowledge, country know-how, and convening power of the World Bank that are the most powerful tools to drive global action. So to give just one example, our new country climate and development reports are working country by country to diagnose priorities, tailor solutions to country circumstances, and build country ownership. I think the World Bank's substantial ability to leverage its balance sheet is also a key advantage over the vertical funds, which of course have a dollar in, dollar out model. Every additional 1 billion of IBRD capital can provide commitments of about $10 billion over the next 10 years. Every dollar contributed to IDA 20 in December will enable at least 3.5 times that in commitment authority, so that there is substantial, there's a substantial balance sheet advantage to the World Bank in this regard. So thanks to this combination of country know-how, world-class knowledge, and balance sheet leveraging, the World Bank Group was able to deliver a record 157 billion surge in commitments in the first 15 months of the crisis. That's a 60% increase on the previous 15-month period. It's higher than the global financial crisis, and it's second to none, frankly, in terms of scale and speed. And in a little over a year, we've committed $10 billion in crisis health financing through our COVID-19 Strategic Preparedness and Response Program. Those funds having already procured billions of dollars of PPE, oxygen products, vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And we now have approved COVID vaccine financing programs up and running in 61 countries, with almost 250 million doses contracted and many more to come soon. And on top of that, in FY21, in the midst of the pandemic, the World Bank was able to deliver record annual climate financing of over 21 billion, which is, please note, up 50% in 2 years. And by the way, over half of that climate finance was for adaptation. The World Bank Group is now by far the largest multilateral provider of climate finance to developing countries. It accounts for more than half of the MDB total of climate finance and over 2/3 of the MDB total of climate adaptation finance. So I think in conclusion, yes, the World Bank can and does support national development goals, public goods, and crisis response all at the same time. Yes, we're evolving constantly. We bring great comparative advantages to this global mission. And I think with a strong and successful IDA 20 in Tokyo in December, we can do even more. So let me stop there, and thanks once again for the chance to join this fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much, Ed. And I'm conscious of the fact that we're running behind, but everybody's got very interesting things to say. And Jürgen is there, and I want to bring him in. But can I just ask you, each of you, one 30-second response, or 60 seconds really, is come back to you first, Ed, just since we're on it. Everybody is saying that the financial model is too conservative, needs to be leveraged differently, ways in which you could do a lot more with the capital, but without ruling out that more capital is important. I want to get a quick response from you on, how much do you see that as part of the solution, the reimagining, rethinking of the financial model of the World Bank?
So that's another gigantic question we could have a whole session on. But I think, look, the World Bank's has been consistently working to strengthen its balance sheet optimization. That's happened through IBRD, where the equity to lending ratio has been adjusted downwards. It's happening in IDA, where of course we've moved from a cash in, cash out IDA of the past to an IDA that now, as I say, leverage is 3.5 times every dollar in cash contributions to achieve to achieve a much bigger commitment of authority. How we handle that is a constant conversation between the bank and its shareholders, and we work within parameters that are agreed with the board in terms of sustainable and annual lending frameworks. We have a big innovation that was introduced as part of the IBRD capital package of a crisis buffer that is set aside within out of the sustainable annual lending limit, precisely so that we can surge in a crisis, as we did, and we triggered that. But I think this is an ongoing discussion. We will be taking steps as part of IDA 20 to introduce some further balance sheet optimization, along with a strong contribution in cash, which is also very important in our ability to provide concessional finance to countries in the biggest need.
Thank you very much. So, Lene, any quick 1 minute on this issue of from where you sit on the board? Is the country-based model that you said, that Ed said, look, that is our main advantage in a way to work with that. From your point of view, do you see the country-based model as doing everything we need to do, or do you think the bank needs to start exploring a range of products and advisory services, lending, financing, and grants that goes outside or beyond the country-based model?
So yes and no. The ability to multiply the input that shareholders give in terms of fresh money to the bank is important, and their ability to mobilize additional resources is important. Is something we talk a lot about, and private capital is one of those areas where the bank needs to multiply more and attract and co-finance. But we're also concerned about the fragmentation in this area. So I am not sure at this point that this is something we should be moving away from, but we need to continue to more efficiently use our resources. I will also note that there is an increasing competition for those resources coming out of the same budget and shareholders' national budgets, which is official development assistance money. Some of this we have to rethink. Should it all come out of the development budget, or should some of these new efforts come out of other budgets, health budgets and other budgets? So, in terms of what we are doing, we constantly have to be innovative and do it more. I think, again, that the bank is up there and willing to engage with others to do that. And again, early consultation is key, and continued efficiency with the money that the bank manages. And I think that's exactly what Ed said, and the direction we need to travel, but obviously we can do more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lene. Come to Nancy and then finally to Nako. Nancy, what's your take on it? Are we going to be able to work entirely with the existing financing and country-based model, or we need to think differently?
I think that by definition, global public goods require an assessment of progress at the global collective level, as well as the individual country contributions. So I think when we talk about additional resources for the institutions, it often is in terms of finance inputs. Let's create another fund. And then let's sort of measure how much finance goes into an activity. I think we need to shift now more toward defining what kinds of outcomes and outputs we want to see at the global level, and then tying increases in capital, both to the institutions as a whole and perhaps as well as new funds, to achievement of those outcomes.
Got it.
So, and that's not something impossible to do. I think private investors and wealth managers are increasingly turning toward how do we get to net zero emissions as opposed to how much of our finance is climate related. But then I would say again, if you're going to do that, if you're going to start setting global goals, you need some sort of piece of architecture that allows you to assess the progress collectively of institutions to achieving those global goals, which is partly a function of country strategies, but it's also a function of how the institutions operate together to achieve these goals at a global level, both for climate and for health.
And pandemics, yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So Naoko, and then Jürgen, I know we were supposed to close off at 10:30, but I think we've managed to get agreement that we can stay for 10 more minutes, which will give us a chance also to hear from Larry, Carmen, and Andy. Any final thoughts before we close out? So if that's all right with you, I'm just going to go to Naoko and then come back. So Naoko.
Yeah, I came here with some skepticism about country-based approach because I was a country director 10 years ago, and then I had very little incentive to work for the global public goods because my client country doesn't necessarily want to have it. So that's why I was a little bit skeptical about how far we can go based on the country-based approach and to provide the global public goods. It assured me that the one bank is now revolutionizing itself so that there is another window and one quarter of the money is maybe meant for the global public goods. Then the question is how that one quarter of the funds can be used. If it's just used on the same incentive structure and the same country-based approach, it's just the additional money, incremental money, then it doesn't deliver it. It has to be structured in a totally different way because incentive structure of the how to provide the global public goods is very different from national public goods. And then because we need to find a way to how to do the system change to put the price on those externalities, how to internalize externalities, that delivery mechanism for the global public goods should really come on top of that current country-based approach. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naoko. So thank you for pointing out that there is a tension between the two, and the incentive structure for just a little more money given and dispersed according to country priorities won't necessarily deliver the global outcome we want. And I think it's important to just bear that in mind as a reality rather than sort of assume it won't be there. So I'm going to come back for a really very quick final thoughts from our initial speakers, and I just on the order in which they spoke. So Carmen, can I come to you first, then Larry, and then Andy?
Well, thanks, Masood. I think it's been a very rich discussion. Larry spoke about how there's never been a larger gap between the opportunities that we have, the opportunities to the social returns, if we take these opportunities, are enormous, and the costs of making these investments are very low. I just wanted to add that even if we all become Nordic, if every major donor was to think like the Nordics and were to do something rational, which is to put in more resources for the global good, let's say we double the amount of resources that today go into the MDBs, let's just say, and that's an ambition, right? It's still going to be vastly inadequate to meet the needs that I outlined earlier. By any simple arithmetic, it's going to be vastly inadequate. So I do want to re-emphasize the need for a fundamental shift in the model of the MDBs and the World Bank in particular towards de-risking the environment, focusing on policy reforms that also de-risk the environment, and mobilizing what is still a very large amount of private capital that is not being deployed in developing countries. The opportunities are enormous. Put another way, if we can provide decent economic returns for private capital, not exorbitant, but decent, and you can make them decent and not exorbitant by reducing the risk. If we can do that, the social returns on public investment will be even larger. So I think the case for shifting the business models of the World Bank and the MDBs to mobilize private finance, focus on policy reform, focus on incentivizing investments in global public goods is powerful, but it requires a lot more thinking and leadership on the part of the boards and management. And it requires, as Nancy says, stronger oversight. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. Larry, you're on mute.
I've spent a reasonable amount of my life being in government or being in international institutions. As I look back on that time, I can think of a number of times in which I wish I had been bolder, in which I wish I had acted with more vision, and in which I had felt less constrained by the conventions and the normal orders of that moment to think in terms of the traditional boxes of the next meeting or the traditional procedures. I can think of none when I look back and think, gosh, I wish I had just been more incremental in the approach that I took. So I'm very mindful of the constraints that people who are currently in office feel. But my plea to them would be to ask themselves what they thought when they first started, before they learned about all the constraints. And my plea to the rest of us would be to create all the space we can for far-reaching and non-incremental change. Let me be frank. I believe that the world is sleepwalking towards doom in the current approaches being taken with respect to climate change and with respect to pandemic and with respect to global poverty. And I do not believe that incremental change derived from tweaks to existing procedures or existing modalities will change that. And I have to regretfully record that much of what I hear seems to me to be desirable, but extremely unlikely to be noted by future historians.
Thank you very much, Larry. Andy, I'll come to you next. You are, of course, right in the middle of some of these constraints. Any final thoughts?
Yes, thanks. Appreciate all those comments. I feel, given the expertise of everyone who has spoken on this sessions, I feel like the students that Tharman mentioned, who not only didn't learn anything last year, but forgot all the stuff they learned from previous years, because there's so much more expertise around the table here. And I certainly also appreciate Secretary Summers' comments. As a long-standing bureaucrat here, it is a definite challenge to try to be bold and think outside the box. I would say, to the credit of this administration, the Biden administration, they are thinking outside the box in a number of different areas, and we will continue to work with everybody here to try to push the envelope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And as you say, I think the administration indeed and many other countries are beginning to recognize this. And I guess the point that Larry Tharman have made is, can we move that speed and ambition level forward to respond to just the magnitude of the challenge that we face? I mean, sleepwalking to doom is not a point at which you want to end a panel, but that is really the message in a way that we need to take on board. So I want to thank all of the panelists, I want to thank all of the speakers, and I want to now try to move to close it out with Jürgen, who's been very much the sort of motivator of us coming together for this event. Jürgen, you have been involved in this field for many, many years. You and I have worked together on off for many decades. So I want to come to you and say, look, you've heard this. Germany has also been over the years kind of pushing at the margin and to get the World Bank to think more about global public goods. There's a window on GPGs that was introduced, if you remember, a few years ago, for which Germany was very much a driver. I want to get your take on this whole conversation and also your suggestions on what do we do next? I mean, this was a great conversation. How do we take this forward?
Thank you, Masood, and thank you everybody for those very important and valid suggestions. Yes, Germany is really has long time argued for better taking into account global public goods into development. It started 20 years ago, and when you look at our development cooperation and the volume, it really increased, and we are now the second biggest donor. So I think combining those two agendas in one makes sense, but it also helps to make the case at home. So I would like to start with the well-known word by the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, who said the global governance of multilateral institutions must focus on global commons and global public goods. I think David Malpass has made a similar comment. The question is now how to walk the talk. We are talking for 20 years. And now with the pandemic and also with the situation regarding climate, I think we have to come to grips. And this means to operationalize that in the global architecture, and there have been many comments on that, the role of WHO, WTO, but now we focus on the MDBs. And there I would like to make 3 points, I think, which I hope reflect the discussion we have had. The first one is on the business model of the bank. The business model of the MDBs, in particular the World Bank, has to better reflect the cross-border challenges and global challenges. And as you said, it's complementary goals. So poverty, shared prosperity on one hand side, and the global challenges on the other. Yes, it's complementary, but how to bring it into one? I think this is still an open issue. And there, Naoko said, put a price on externalities. Yes, let us put a price on externalities, but the bank clients pay the same for an investment which has positive externalities for the whole world than for an investment which doesn't. There is no concessional money for middle income countries, for example, working on global challenges. So there are no incentives. And therefore, we have to look at the MDBs to create those incentives, better terms, financing terms, more money, additional resources. And I think this is something we have to get to grips. We can't stop just saying we have to reconcile and it's easy to reconcile. It's not easy. Let us create the policies. And my second point is additional resources. Of course, the whole system needs additional resources. We cannot say just take better on board global public goods to the development agencies if there are no additional resources. So we have to look at that. We were discussing SDRs, very promising. We discussed possible dedicated capital increases. There are many ideas around. So let us look at that. And my third point is better cooperation. We have those thematic funds like the Green Climate Fund, and others. And in a way, one could combine financing of these funds with MDB money. It's done, but it's very cumbersome. And please let us identify the bottlenecks and make the system more workable. And this is also, I think, what Thurman said, better bringing, mobilizing private finance, looking at policy reforms. The MDBs do not have such an incentives to look at policy reforms. They also want to spend money. That's really tough work. That's costly. So we asked, for example, the bank to increase the reforms climate related to development policy operations. It's now 13%. This should go up to 50%. So the countries have to get support to do this energy and climate transition. Policy reforms are important. So in terms of next steps, we will have the annual meetings, and there one topic will be prevention, preparedness, and responses, the World Bank's role in future crisis. So that's the issue. So let us bring this, what we have discussed today, into this debate. And perhaps linked to that, I remember there was a paper on global public goods by the World Bank in 2003, in 2008, and since then, nothing. Since then, we live with the expectation that we will bring together those issues into one, but we don't know how. So why not asking the bank to do another paper after now, let's see, 13 years, and focus on the two top global public goods, which is the pandemic prevention and climate protection. Do another paper and tell us how to reconcile the country model with the global challenges in the interest of the countries. That's my contribution. Over to you, Masood.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. I'm glad you sort of laid out both the ambition level that we need, sort of non-incremental, and also the fact that here's some very practical ways in which some obstacles that need to be overcome. The terms of financing for borrowing countries, middle-income countries. If they're the same for things that happen, for those projects that have an externality as they are for others, then there's not really the incentive. Similarly, we think about financing for the MDBs, for the World Bank. There's a resilience and sustainability trust that is being proposed at the IMF, which will give the IMF some, I don't know, $50 billion to provide support to countries for the macroeconomic dimensions of largely climate change related work. Why don't we think about a resilience and sustainability trust of $100 billion for the World Bank, which would actually use some of those SDRs, not only to on-lend directly, but maybe some of that can be treated as quasi-equity. And then you have the leverage that Ed talked about earlier on. So I think there are all of these ideas that need to be explored, and there's clearly work to be done going forward. The annual meetings next week being a very important milestone. Before I close, because we are now well over time, Tharman, I see your electronic hand is up, and I just wanted to make sure that was there something you wanted to say, or if so, let me just come back to you before we close out.
Well, no, I just wanted to underline the point that Larry made about sleepwalking towards doom. We can avoid it by putting substantially more official resources into the game, by changing business models, by cooperating differently, and by mobilizing private finance. And all those four things are essential. So lest it be misunderstood, everything I was saying was premised on substantially greater official commitments as well.
Right.
But that alone isn't enough. It needs to be accompanied by a fundamentally new orientation in development finance. And I just wanted to underline that.
No, thank you very much for letting us end on that point. And I guess in a way you could say, we may be sleepwalking to doom, but if we wake up and change our direction, we don't have to end up there. And I think that's really the things that we need to do next. So thanks to all the panelists, thanks to all of you who joined in. And this is clearly a conversation that we will need to continue because there are many issues that have been raised which we need to go deeper into, and I look forward to that. Thanks again for everyone.